This video is sponsored by World Anvil. When the new live-action D&D movie was first announced, I remember a lot of debate and speculation among my friends about what characters would be the leads of the film. But that discussion dried up pretty quickly when we realized this wasn't going to be a Dragonlance movie. If it were, they'd have said so in the announcement. And this wasn't going to be a Drizzt Do'Urden movie. Although he was originally going to have a small role, but that didn't end up happening, and he was replaced by the best character in the entire movie. And I remember the dawning realization among my friends that outside of Drizzt and the Dragonlance lead characters, there are functionally no noteworthy main characters in Dungeons & Dragons. Now, there are other beloved characters, don't get me wrong. Minsk and Boo were created for the Baldur's Gate video games and have been adapted for plenty of other official D&D material, like tie-in comics and Magic the Gathering cards. But he's a companion. The lead children from the D&D cartoon were iconic for the kids who grew up watching that show, but they're specifically humans from our world. They're not native to any D&D world. And there are presumably lots of other main characters from other published novels, but none of those are as popular as Drizzt or Dragonlance. And some D&D players can go for years without ever hearing about Drizzt and have no idea who he is until they happen to learn about him from a YouTuber or wander down a Barnes & Noble aisle of tie-in D&D novels. But I remember wondering something else. I wondered which of D&D's actual iconic characters would appear in the film, or might just show up in a mid-credit scene to tease a sequel, which thankfully they didn't do. Not everything needs to be the MCU, and that's okay. But the reason I wondered about that is because, really, the only truly iconic characters D&D has, the ones who are guaranteed to return from edition to edition, are their villains. I'm not going to pretend there aren't some NPCs who are iconic to the people who have played in certain adventures. But no offense meant to the cavalcade of colorful companions in Out of the Abyss, but those characters don't tend to return in future adventures, because the writers of an adventure can't guarantee that the side characters will survive. In fact, on a long enough timeline, beloved NPCs are practically guaranteed to die at the hands of a villain, and there's a scientific reason for that. We'll talk about that another day. But villains endure. And because you can never keep a good villain down, they tend to return again and again and again. But there are actually a few reasons why villains always return, and why they become so iconic. If you like this kind of video, make sure to join the Discord server. We're at just over 1,000 members, and it's a really wonderful community. Plus, Discord members will be the first to hear some exciting announcements I've got about my favorite villains, so if you'd like to be in the loop, sign up for the Discord. The first reason villains endure more than any other character has a lot to do with the nature of how RPG adventures work. Because honestly, pre-written modules are a deeply weird form of writing. They often get compared to technical manuals, and certainly some of the earliest modules are just as obtuse and difficult to parse as you might expect from that description. But even with more modern adventures, which have a focus on clarity and artwork and punchy prose, they're still adventure stories that don't know who the main characters are going to be. And without that incredibly crucial piece of the puzzle, there's only so much the adventure's authors can guarantee about your experience. For example, let's look at Tyranny of Dragons, the first hardcover adventure published for 5th edition. Early in the campaign, the heroes are meant to rescue a monk named Leosin Erlenthar, and then he recruits you for further missions. He's a member of the Harpers, and he's meant to be a trustworthy contact for the party. And the first time I played the game, as the DM, my players absolutely hated him. Now, maybe I just played the character as much more unlikable than I intended, maybe my characters just resented having to answer to someone or have a problem with authority, maybe they were just really annoyed at being sent on a railroad quest when they wanted something more freeform. But ultimately, the why doesn't matter, because that kind of experience is hardly unique. There's only so much a module can do to advise you on how to play an NPC, and it's especially hard for them to help you make an NPC beloved, because something that makes my players love an NPC might make your players hate that exact same character. As it turns out, getting people to like someone is extremely subjective. There's not a one-size-fits-all solution. Hot take, I know. And of course, that assumes your players will even interact with the NPC or take the bait on the quest at all. But you can't guarantee how players will behave. Sure, you sent them there to rescue Leosin because he was being held captive, but what if they get there and they say,
"Nah, that's alright. Good luck."
And this is why so many modules are considered to be only as good as their villains. Because at the end of the day, across a long enough timeline of hundreds of players and thousands of game sessions, that's the only common denominator you can even vaguely hope to remain consistent. NPCs come and go, but at the end of the day, the players need someone to fight. The GM might change monsters, MacGuffins, even the villain's stats, but they're still using a published adventure for a reason. And the writers of that adventure put a big bad villain at the end of it, because ultimately, that's what's going to give the players a satisfying enough experience to walk away content with a job well done. Additionally, a strong enough villain concept can have a compounding effect of improving an adventure by adding clarity to the story. If your villain is clear and easy to understand, then as you write the adventure, you'll find that the choice of villain ends up unlocking a lot of other decisions as you go along. A good villain can functionally tell you what kind of minions the heroes will fight at the beginning of the adventure, what kinds of monsters and mini-bosses might be seeded through the campaign, what sorts of allies could be recruited to help, maybe even where the final battle will take place. For example, if you know that your adventure's villain is a 5-headed dragon queen goddess, you can use that as a key to unlock what sort of minions and monsters might make sense. If they're a queen of evil dragons, then you can include a bunch of chromatic dragons in the story. If she's an evil goddess, then she can also have a bunch of cultists. And since you have this other piece of lore that says that giants are the ancient enemies of dragons, you also have an idea for what kind of NPC allies the party might be able to recruit. The same goes for metallic dragons. They're always opposed to the actions of chromatic dragons, so maybe the party can ride on a metallic dragon as part of the adventure. And the evil dragon goddess has an enemy, a good dragon god, so his followers and subjects can be helpful NPCs and allies. Or maybe your villain is a spooky vampire. Well, you can drill down on what makes a vampire cool, and use that to build up a dynamic layer full of minions. Maybe you create a spooky castle full of vampire brides, witches, enchanted suits of armor, maybe some zombies in the basement. Throw all the Scooby-Doo things in there. And if you're adapting that adventure years later and you want to flesh out the lands around the castle, you've got a great jumping off point. Because vampires are just one of a bunch of iconic public domain monsters we associate with gothic horror and black and white monster movies. Dip into the others and add layers for wolfmen, ghosts, Frankenstein brides, and more witches. And since we're discussing the idea that an adventure might be fleshed out and expanded into a more detailed adventure, let's tackle another reason some of these villains become iconic. Nostalgia. You can never predict which elements of a D&D adventure will be the most memorable for your players. For example, I have friends who still warmly remember one shocking roll on a random encounter table, or their favorite Wild Magic Surge result. I get questions about my favorite Natural 20 or Natural 1, and honestly, I don't even remember those rolls most of the time. My brain just clearly doesn't work that way. But apparently, a lot of people remember specific crits and crit fails, and remember them for decades. I mean, I'm just guessing. I'm assuming that's why people ask that question. They have those sorts of memories. But if you get the villain right, your players can have a lot of fun trying to slay them, and the warm feeling of satisfaction they'll get from putting that monster in the ground will stay with them for literally years. And over time, if the ending was satisfying enough, they'll forget about all the weirdness and waffling that it took to get them there. They'll forget about the dead-end side quests and the off-color jokes that would make you cringe today. The villain will loom large in their memory. And then you'll run the same adventure for more people, and those players will take those experiences with them into the world, with the villains seared into their memories. And some of your players will go on to run the same adventure for their own players, or write their own adventure but use the same villain. They might even remember some things you did as the villain and play their villain the same way, or change those to something that will make the villain work better for their group. And over enough time, across enough games, through the oral tradition that is D&D, these villains take on a life of their own. And now, a word from our sponsor. Hi folks, it's Future Mike. I just got done doing a live stream for my patrons. We're doing a series of live streams where I build a world on camera and you get to see my process. In this session, we figured out the prehistory of the world, so all the empires that had risen and fallen before the modern era. There's some awesome stuff we figured out. We figured out that there was a particular nation that came to power after the people slayed a Tarrasque. So I think that's going to be a lot of fun for players in this world to explore and discover. But, of course, one of the challenges when you're building a world like this is you want to make sure the information is available to you, but not necessarily all in front of the players all at once, right? Like, they have to sort of discover this stuff through adventuring and playing D&D. So how can you keep all this information somewhere that you can access without having it all in front of the players at once, or having it be overwhelming, but still being able to roll out the information when they want it and when they discover it? World Anvil. Use World Anvil. World Anvil is an online toolkit that you can use to organize your notes and share details with your players at your own pace. For example, I need all this information about the prehistory of the world in easy access when I'm running the game, but I don't want it anywhere where the players can see it. Luckily for me, World Anvil's Chronicles feature allows me to create multiple timelines and keep certain events hidden on timelines that the players can't see, so they won't spoil the surprise for themselves. If you're grappling with the same problem in your own games, check out World Anvil. It is a really helpful resource, and they're offering a discount to the viewers of this channel. If you visit worldanvil.com/supergeekmike and use the promo code SUPERGEEK at checkout, you could save 40% off of any annual membership. Once again, that is worldanvil.com/supergeekmike and use the promo code SUPERGEEK at checkout for 40% off of any annual membership. Thank you so much to World Anvil for sponsoring this video. But of course, we've spent a lot of time talking about how villains become iconic for esoteric, ephemeral, and quasi-romantic reasons. No, not that kind of romantic. Although actually, sometimes that kind of romantic. Y'all are thirsty for the Briarwoods and for Strahd, and I'm worried about you. But of course, TTRPGs are a business, and there are really good branding reasons for why these villains become iconic. First, nostalgia. Did you know you can bottle nostalgia and sell it to people?
Nostalgia literally means the pain from an old wound.
He is a character that we own. He's a great villain, lots of potential there. And so we are talking about what is the story around Venger that we can tell, and how might characters become embroiled in that story.
It's a twinge in your heart, far more powerful than memory alone.
Now, I don't say this cynically. I do think that the writers of these modern D&D adventures like the old stories they're adapting or referencing. But I've also talked before about why it was just good business for Wizards of the Coast to focus their 5e publishing efforts on highlighting their valuable IP. And just from a purely practical level, since we've already discussed that D&D functionally has no main characters you can include in your merchandise, you kind of have to focus all of your efforts on the villains. You can make a few action figures and Funko Pops for the few memorable NPCs who have reared their heads in 5e, but honestly, it's just a safer bet to focus on the villains. Additionally, the goal of merchandise is to evoke your experience with the source material. And you probably aren't going to get a hit of nostalgia dopamine if you see a t-shirt with, like, one of the pieces of art from the Player's Handbook. But you will get that feeling from artwork or figures or whatever based around the villain. That's also why they put out board games about fighting these villains, because that still continues to evoke the experience you have at the D&D table, playing through a campaign to take down the giants or slay a Chardalon, the Red Dragon. And honestly, this is a sincere question. Who else in the entire canon of D&D could ever even hope to be as iconic as the villains? The player's experiences with the NPCs are too unpredictable, and heaven forbid you try to make anything that represents the player characters themselves. You might not have noticed, but adventurers hardly ever appear on the cover of 5e adventures anymore, because the designers can't even attempt to capture what those characters are going to look like. The starter sets are the only adventures that always put heroes on the cover, because you are trying to sell a new customer on what the experience of D&D is like, so they need to be able to imagine themselves doing it. That's the same reason adventurers are on the cover of books that are more like Candlekeep Mysteries, or Keys from the Golden Vault, or Mythic Odysseys of Theros. Those books are selling you something outside of the traditional campaign format, so you need to be able to imagine yourself in the experience in order to get hooked. But beyond that, D&D heroes look so unpredictable these days, you can't really justify putting them on the cover anymore. These creators are just better off putting all their efforts on rendering the villain and their victims. But that being said, there is another entity who is part of every single D&D campaign, and if you could find a way to actually depict them, you could hit those nostalgia buttons and maybe make an absolute buttload of money. But you can't, because it's literally impossible. That entity is the Dungeon Master. Now, the D&D cartoon did make the Dungeon Master into a character, since the DM is such an integral part of the D&D experience. But they made him this weird little dude, a wizard or an imp or a god or... I don't know, man, it's weird. I don't think any Dungeon Masters actually imagine themselves this way when they think about how much power they have in the game. Well, okay, maybe Chris Perkins does, but besides him, no, this isn't gonna land for most people. Honestly, the most common artwork I see for the DM is this hooded figure. Some version of this is used for the Kobold Guide to Game Mastering and for the art of Matt Mercer in the animated intros and official artwork for Critical Role. And even outside of those very specific examples, it's a pretty popular archetype. But I don't think everyone sees themselves this way when they imagine themselves DMing. I know I don't ever visualize myself looking like this. I don't like the hood, really, that's what it is for me. I'd much rather be in full wizard garb, a big floppy hat and everything. And honestly, the way the most popular D&D actual play adaptations depict the DM reflects this as well. In the Adventure Zone comics, Griffin McElroy is just himself, hanging out in another panel and looking down at the players. And I just talked about how Matt Mercer is rendered as this mysterious god in the official artwork, but in the cartoon, he just shows up as a series of unnamed NPCs who have horrible things happen to them over and over again, which is honestly the most faithful way you can adapt the DM experience. So, without anyone else to be considered iconic, and because of all the other reasons we already talked about, villains wind up being the most iconic element of just about any D&D adventure. That's a position that they've earned by being the focal point for the adventure, or having a great design, or having been part of the hobby's history for decades and being a really good figure to name an adventure after. Now, that's not to say that every D&D adventure has an iconic villain. Temple of Elemental Evil is just famous as itself, and even Tomb of Horrors, which has a cameo or two from Acererak, has still developed its own unique identity, separate. It has a logo that literally has nothing to do with what he looks like. But those aren't scenarios where we tend to imagine any individual we can grow attached to. Like, seriously, you definitely shouldn't get attached to anyone you see in the Tomb of Horrors. That's just setting yourself up for heartbreak. But at the end of the day, when we visualize D&D, we don't share a mental image of one adventurer, or even of a single adventuring party. More often than not, if we do share a mental image of anyone, it's a villain. Thank you so much for watching. Obviously, I don't want to discount the fact that some D&D heroes from adaptations become iconic too, but because we don't tend to experience the game from their perspective, they don't take off in the same way. For example, the Dragonlance heroes aren't iconic because they're the pre-generated characters in the original modules. They're iconic because of the novels. Same with Drizzt Do'Urden. While I've got no doubt that hundreds of D&D players have rolled up their own versions of Drizzt at their table, the reason they've done that is because of those novels. The kids from the cartoon were memorable enough to get referenced in a few recent adventures, and they even snagged a cameo in the new movie. And I'm sure the heroes from this movie will have a place in the hearts of a lot of people who care about D&D. But those characters are hard to link with the experience of playing the game because we associate them with a different hobby, consuming novels and TV shows and movie, which is just a more passive experience. Side note, I was actually genuinely a little surprised that the filmmakers had enough restraint not to throw the heroes into battle with one of D&D's most iconic villains in the first film, and instead chose to wait for a possible sequel to deal with a larger threat. I know that this is awfully late and the movie's already out of theaters and on streaming services. It'll probably be on Blu-ray in a little bit more than a week, but I really like that movie, and I hope it gets a sequel. Also, shout out to the folks who recognized me when we were leaving our screening of the D&D movie. That was awesome. It's literally the first time that's ever happened to me. It was super nice to meet them. Thank you so much for saying hi. I really appreciate it. Anyway, if you like this video and you want to support the channel, please hit the subscribe button and ring the bell. Those really help the channel grow. You can support me financially on Patreon. Every new patron helps a lot. Even if all you can do is support at $1 a month, that still means a lot to me. If you can't support financially, you can still join my Discord community to hang out with other awesome viewers of this channel. And you can sign up for my newsletter to catch my semi-regular updates. Make sure to follow me on Twitch for live streams. I try to stream at least once a week, behind-the-scenes content and upcoming videos that I record on Twitch. If you enjoyed the section of this video or discuss the behind-the-scenes process for how a great villain can inspire the rest of the adventure's design, I think you're really going to like my video about the world-building process of the first Star Wars movie. Until next time, play fair and have fun.